Problems with capital budgeting. While adding a capital budget seems like a very good idea, there are enormous practical difficulties with implementing a capital budget because it is very hard to distinguish government consumption from investment spending. For example, is the purchase of a missile a capital investment or current period consumption? Does it does its classification depend on how soon the missile is used? Are investments in education capital expenditures because they build up the abilities of a future generation of workers? And if these are capital expenditures, how can we value them? For example, without selling the spectrum of licenses in 1997, how could the government appropriately assess the value of this intangible asset? In Chapter 8, we discuss the difficulties of appropriately valuing these types of investments. These difficulties make it easier for politicians to misstate the government's budgetary position with a capital budget than without one. As a result of these difficulties, while some states use capital budgets, they have not been implemented at the federal level. The international experience with capital budgeting at the national level is mixed. Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands all had capital budgeting at one point but abandoned the practice because they thought it led to excessive political focus on government capital investments. Currently, New Zealand and the United Kingdom have capital budgets, while the United Kingdom's capital budgeting process is very recent. New Zealand's system has been in place for more than 15 years. Static versus dynamic scoring. Another important source of current debate over budget measurement is the debate between static and dynamic scoring. When budget estimators assess the impact of policies on the government budget, they account for many behavioral effects of these policies. For example, people spend more on child care when the government subsidizes child care expenditures. Similarly, people are more likely to sell assets to realize a capital gain if the capital gains tax rate on such asset sales is reduced. While budget estimators take into account these types of effects of policies on individual and firm behavior in computing the overall effect of legislation, they do not take into account that a tax policy might affect the size of the economy as well. That is, budget modelers use static scoring, which assumes that the size of the economic pie is fixed and that government policy serves only to change the relative size of the slices of the pie. Sidebar: static scoring, a method used by budget modelers that assumes that government policy changes only the distribution of total resources, not the amount of total resources. Dynamic scoring, a method used by budget modelers that attempt to model the effect of government policy on both the distribution of total resources and the amount of total resources. Returning to the text, the static assumption has been strongly criticized by those who believe that government policy affects not only the distribution of resources within the economy, but the size of the economy itself. These analysts advocate a dynamic scoring, an approach to budget modeling that includes not only a policy's efforts on resource distribution, but also its effects on the size of the economy. For example, lowering taxes on economic activity, such as labor income taxes, may increase the amount of that activity, hours worked, increasing the production of society. This larger economic pie in turn produces more tax revenues for a given tax rate, offsetting to some extent the revenue losses from the tax reduction. Ignoring this reaction can lead the government to overstate the revenue loss from cutting taxes. Budget estimators have resisted the dynamic approach largely because the impact of government policy on the economy is not well understood. Nevertheless, as proponents of dynamic scoring point out, it is not clear why policymakers and budget estimators should assume there are zero effects. The Congressional Budget Office took a small step toward dynamic scoring in its 2003 evaluation of the budget proposed by President Bush, which included sizable tax cuts and increased defense spending. The CBO used 5 different models to evaluate the long-run impacts of the administration's budget on the economy, including feedback effects on tax revenues and government spending. The message that they delivered was fairly consistent. Unless the 2003 budget proposals were accompanied by tax increases within a decade, dynamic effects would increase their budgetary costs. This is because the budgetary changes on net increased the deficit. As we discussed in section 4.4, the increased government borrowing that would occur as a result would crowd out private savings, decrease investment, and ultimately decrease economic growth. Slower economic growth in the long run would cause a fall in future tax revenues, raising the deficit further.